In part one, we left off talking about different types of muscle contraction, and we also talked about some of the basic features and characteristics of muscle that give them their ability to contract and do the various things that we've talked about thus far. So there's an important relationship between the type of contraction that we see a muscle performing, so it's either getting longer, it's getting shorter, and the force that it's having to produce relative to the weight that it's moving or the load that it's moving. All right. So this is what's known as the force velocity relationship of muscle. This is essentially looking at how much force is needed by a muscle in order to move a load with a particular weight whenever the muscle is getting longer versus whenever the muscle is getting shorter. All right. So what we'll see is that whenever a muscle is getting shorter with a concentric contraction, the relationship between the force and the velocity is inverse. All right. We'll see that whenever the muscle is getting longer, eccentric contraction, the relationship between the force and the velocity is direct. All right. So if we look at the first one, so during a concentric muscle contraction, the relationship between force and velocity is inverse. The best way to understand this is to put yourself in a position put yourself in a position in which you're going to have to move a load whenever the muscle is getting shorter, right? So imagine you have your arms straight out in front of you, okay? Straight out in front of you, and I set a 20-pound weight on your hands, and I tell you to move that weight up, right? Or move it to your chest, okay? Or you could also think of, say you have your arms down at your side and your waist and you have a 20-pound weight in your hand, and I say, flex your arm and flex your elbow and bring it up to your chest or bring it up to your head, right? What this is saying is here we're getting shorter, right? So this is concentric contraction. The greater the amount of force that you have to produce because the weight is heavier, the slower that contraction is going to be, right? So you can think of this very simply. You can move a 5-pound weight from your side up to your chest or your head much faster than you can move a 20-pound weight, right? The reason is because you're producing more force with the heavier weight, right? So here, if we're looking on this side, heavier weight, you have to produce more force. So because you're producing more force with a heavier weight, you also have gravity acting against you. That speed is going to be much slower. You're going to move the weight at a much slower rate than you would a lighter weight, right? So if you do the same thing, but now you use a lighter weight, so you use a 5-pound weight or a 2-pound weight, you produce less force to move it because the load is less, so you're able to move it much more quickly, right? So that's for a concentric contraction, right? You're getting shorter. The muscle is shortening. For an eccentric contraction in which you're elongating the muscle, right? You're stretching it out. The relationship is direct, right? So in this case, we're stretching our muscles. So again, imagine you have a weight in your hands and you have it up against your chest and your elbows are flexed, right? And say it's a 45-pound weight and you begin to move that weight out in front of you. Because of gravity, because we're elongating here, we are elongating the muscle. It is a greater weight, right? It's a greater force. Heavier weight. We have to produce more force in our muscles to be able to hold that and to maintain its position. So it's going to move much faster, right? If you have your arms out in front of you and I drop a 30-pound weight on your hands, you're going to move, your hands are going to drop and fall down much more quickly than if I drop a 5-pound weight on your hands, right? So the heavier weight, the more force you generate in the muscle to maintain it, but the faster that muscle is going to elongate because there's more weight, right? It's a heavier weight, gravity's acting down with it, and it's an eccentric contraction, right? It's getting longer. Same thing if we use a lighter weight. So if you have your arms out in front and I drop a 5-pound weight, that muscle is going to elongate much more slowly because it's a smaller weight, it's a smaller load, and you also have to produce less force and generate less tension in order to maintain that weight's position in space, right? Or maintain your arm's position. Okay. So you can think about this. It's not as confusing as it seems whenever you think about, okay, is the muscle getting longer or shorter? And then so what's the relationship then between the weight of my object? Is it direct if I'm looking at an eccentric contraction, or is it inverse when I'm looking at a concentric contraction? All right. So you have access to this video in your notes if you have If you have the notes, you can copy and paste this URL here into a web browser, and you can watch this video, but it's essentially showing the same thing that we just talked about, this relationship between the speed at which you can contract the muscle and it moves relative to the amount of weight or the load that you're having to act against. And again, this is going to differ between eccentric contractions and concentric contractions, right? So we'll stop here with this part, kind of a short part, and we'll pick up with the next part, talking about how our muscles can function in lever systems in the body.